This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again Judge Tom Engel, who's visiting us from the Empire State of the North, aka New York State. Now, Tom, I often start these little conversations by bemoaning the fact that candidates just haven't come forward to fill the needs of the American public. I know that right now many people have put their name in the hat for being president, but I have to say that there is an opening for vice president. And no one, as far as I know, is running for that position. Have you considered possibly, does that, I think you'd secure some support depending on how well you do tonight here on that.
On which ticket were you thinking?
Well, I mean, that's right. It would be up to you, Tom. I think
Vice President Pence looks like he's sitting pretty, but I have heard rumors that the president is considering the United Nations ambassador, who's governor of South Carolina.
Haley, is that it?
Yeah.
Is that her name, Haley? I think Governor Haley.
Yeah, Governor Haley of South Carolina, and she, of course, left the UN post. But I've heard that he might, quote unquote, dump Pence, or maybe find a sinecure for him in a cabinet post or something, and take on Ambassador Haley.
That happened with FDR, did it not?
He had three vice presidents.
Wallace, so he tossed Wallace out.
He had
Gardner.
Garner for 2 terms. Then he had Wallace in his 3rd term, and in 1944 he dumped Wallace for Harry Truman.
And had he not done that, Wallace, who's quite far to the left, would have been the president.
Yeah, that's right. He ended up, I think, running as a socialist in 1948. Wallace did.
Well, Tom, this is your chance. I have no discussion with you earlier about what particular wisdom you wish to bestow upon the American people. What is it? Are you interested in some of the events that are taking place?
Well, first, let me say that I believe, and I inherited this from my father, that the wisdom of the American people can bestow itself on me rather than vice versa.
Well said, Tom. Well said. We're always on the lookout for whatever hazelnut, so to speak, drops in our pocket here from whatever source. So wisdom
right.
from the American people, and you're an American person too, Tom. So hopefully you've got some observations.
Well,
how are things going up in New York State?
In New York, I don't think things are going terribly well. We have a out of control Democratic controlled Assembly, Senate, and governor for the first time in I think 10, 12 years, and they just can't find enough things to spend money on. And then we have a mayor in New York, about whom I have never heard a good word from any one of my friends, be they right, left, or center.
Yes.
So we labor under that yoke in New York, but we're still managing.
Well, Tom, I've often drawn the parallel in the U.S. Between Spain, 1935, and the U.S. now, in that you're now in Andalusia here, a conservative part of the country. And Catalonia, you could say, is maybe New York and Boston. And so the cultural differences are fairly extraordinary. And then maybe we could parse out some of the differences and the political arrangement there. We're sort of puzzled in this part of the world as to many of the ideas that come from that part of our nation and the people that support those ideas and where they could have come from. It seems to be pretty much a rejection of sort of traditional American viewpoints, or some idea about a new kind of country, a new kind of world? And any thoughts about, I mean, how does that playing into these the political figures you mentioned?
Well, the Northeast is famously liberal, and I think it's contagious at this point. My wife and I have been giving some thought to relocating, getting out of New York City, because it's so expensive.
Yes.
And it's very hard to continue living there. And so when we look around, we look at states that are close enough to New York so that we could get back to the city for
right.
whatever we wanted. And it's hard to do because New Jersey is in even worse shape than New York, and Connecticut, which used to be a shining star, decided to install an income tax in
Yes.
early 90s.
Yes.
And their economy has completely dropped through and fallen, and the taxes there are roughly comparable to those in New York. So those two adjoining states
Yes.
are not in the picture. I mean, even a place as liberal as Massachusetts
Yes.
is doing better than those three states.
Yes, and it's the high tax issues, and also, I guess, people formerly the engine that drove everything was the financial district in Manhattan, and it's possible to do things somewhere else, is there not? I mean, you don't necessarily have to be in that the tri-state area to do your work.
You with some of the big financing houses, banks and brokerage houses and so forth, certainly if you're going to be pursuing a leadership role in those mega institutions, you have to be in or near New York. But certainly a lot of people are doing business right out of their basement
Yes.
and elsewhere. So I think it's certainly more possible these days to do business outside New York. I mean, New York has turned the upstate portion,
Yes.
which is about 98% of its land mass, into a desert. When the Democratic governors, and I'm talking about Governor David Patterson, Eliot Spitzer, Cuomo, they are all in complete thrall of the environmental types,
Yes.
the Greens, and so they prevented fracking for natural gas and oil in the very rich Marcellus Shale Formation and the Utica Shale Formation, which are in the southern tier, which is that border along Pennsylvania, whereas Governor Rendell, who is a moderate Democrat in Pennsylvania, permitted fracking, and that has been a complete boon, not only to the Pennsylvania economy and to its tax base, but to, most importantly, the people on that side of the border. You just don't see that in New York. As long as Democrats can win the votes from New York City and take a sufficient plurality every year, then they just ignore upstate. As a consequence, a place like Buffalo, for example,
Yes.
has for the last several years been losing 50 people a day. These departures from New York have been accelerated by the tax bill that was passed during the Trump first year by the Republican Congress, which put a cap on the deduction of state and local taxes. As a result, people who used to write big checks to New York State, for example, for for their state taxes, those were in a way subsidized by the rest of the country
Yes.
because they were deductible on their federal returns. So that's caused a real problem for New York, New Jersey, and even Connecticut, where you are draining the states of high earners who have plenty of other places to go. They go to Florida or Texas or even Tennessee.
You know, as far as Georgia, we have a state income tax here, and it's slowly diminished to 5.5%, and it's a sort of across-the-board kind of tax. I mean, I think that's in sort of the middle, but it's certainly a much better number than you have to pay in New York City and New York State, and with all the other encumbrances that exist there. There's some ideas about maybe doing something with our income tax, dropping it a notch to just attract people. I think Florida's really sort of a place where thousands of people come just for those reasons, to escape the situation.
There's no question about that.
So possibly Georgia could become more of a boat hole than it is, although our population is booming here. We have 11 million people in the state, and we've become the 8th largest state in population, and it's growing enormously. We have our own issues. One of them is we have recently the legislature signed the heartbeat bill in regards to abortion, which means that
I've been following that.
Right, and I mean that's part of this divide I spoke about earlier. These conservative parts of the country are, I guess, taking steps to bring this case before the Supreme Court. I mean, obviously that's what's going to happen, and there's been some I guess, pushback from Hollywood. One of the things that's happened in the state is the past administrations have done arrangements with Hollywood to give them substantial tax benefits. They really get an enormous tax benefit to come here, and as a result, there's a major sort of motion picture industry has appeared here, and then this may have an impact on that.
Well, I've read about that, and I've read that Hollywood doesn't want to come here anymore because of the passage of this abortion bill, you know, I don't approve of those kinds of subsidies anyway. I think that's a business that government shouldn't be in, granting huge subsidies to encourage particular industries, because it'll come back and slap you in the face just the way it has Georgia now.
But doesn't the government just routinely do that? So, in other words, if you look at
what government?
The U.S. government, every government there is, pretty much, particularly, well, in North America. So they might give subsidies to people that grow peanuts or don't grow peanuts, or people that use, I don't know, they use, they put in ethanol, right, into their gasoline, and so all kinds of things. And as far as that go, tariffs. So they might not like smoking, for instance, and so they might just put a lot of tax on cigarettes. But I take your point that is that's one of the things, and actually you could make the strong case that it's a little bit, people enjoy in Georgia seeing films being made. And in fact, in Macon, there's often a film crew here. And all over the state, and so people like that. Well, there's a film crew here, and it's
coming right out of their pockets.
Yes, indeed. And so what happens is that the interstices of the deal is that the state government more or less gives Hollywood tax write-offs, and they sell those tax write-offs. So I mentioned the state income tax, but a common thing is, at least in some circles, is that you can buy these. Hollywood owns film credits, and they can then sell the film credits and recoup the money for the expenses they had here. So if I got the actors, the actresses don't want to come here. I don't doubt the bankers and accountants do want this to happen. And so these are sold, and they basically reduce the state income tax to some figure between 85 and 90% of what it normally would be. So for instance, if you owe the government $10,000 in state taxes, then in many circles, the routine thing is to send the money to Hollywood and then only pay and give Hollywood $8,500. And then your taxes are thus, you have a $1,500 benefit. And the Hollywood gets a substantial benefit. It's almost like the legislature is writing a check to give to Hollywood. And some states have...
Does that participation get you any income otherwise or revenue? Or does it just reduce your tax bill?
It just reduces your tax bill. So if you say, here's your tax bill, it's $10,000 from the state. That sounds like a little too much for me. Why don't I just buy a film credit and I'll only have to pay $8,500?
Yeah.
So I'll say $1,500. And other states have objected to this. And so one of them is North Carolina, where the legislature stopped doing that. Well, that's some of the, just probing these cultural differences. One thing would be, I guess, the whole complicated story of reproductive rights. It's very complicated, isn't it? Rights, responsibilities, what's going on with abortion, or woman's right to choose. And it really is, in every realm, it's such a controversial issue. I mean, on both sides of here too, not only in, it's not everyone is uniformly on one side or the other on this.
Well, states have gone their separate ways. I mean, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio have all passed more restrictive abortion regulations and laws just since the last election, whereas other states, including New York, have liberalized their abortion laws to permit abortion right up until the point of birth, essentially.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And Virginia, of course, was another state that was trying to do that, and their governor, Northam, was a physician himself, and he described this rather grisly business of
supporting it, I believe.
Yeah,
but the fact is, his grisly support was enough to turn the bill back, I think.
Well, then he got in trouble because he'd drawn some. So he was photographed as a medical student.
Allegedly, there's a debate of what he says.
Well, yeah, whether it was he or not, it was on his yearbook page, and that was enough to do that. And I think maybe the one caused the other. I think a lot of people were offended by his position on these late-term abortions and went and scouted out some embarrassing things about him.
Yes.
And
well, I think that's right. Right. And that sort of provoked the scandal that occurred.
Sure.
Well, Judge Engel, I know you watch these issues, but isn't this something that's going to come to the Supreme Court? And how is that going to happen? I mean, these laws, the Georgia law, for instance, I mean, won't that be immediately restricted? Is that, I mean,
well, generally speaking, those will go before a district judge, and the NARAL and National Abortion Rights League or whatever it is will bring it, or Planned Parenthood or some other organization say you can't do this because of Roe versus Wade, and actually there's a subsequent case called Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is actually the governing law now, which is a little less black and white than Roe versus Wade, and probably what will happen is that the cases from these various states on both sides, on the liberal side and on the conservative side, will percolate up through the district courts and then to the circuit courts. And circuit courts may, particularly because the Trump administration has been very successful in confirming judges on the appellate courts, that you could get different results from different circuits. And that's a classic reason, maybe the classic reason why the Supreme Court wants to take a case, because they don't want to have a conflict between circuits. So that may well be the way it arises, and that would be good from Chief Justice Roberts' point of view, because it doesn't look like he's fishing for the case. It's just something that because of the conflict between the circuits, naturally bubbles up, and the court would traditionally, and has traditionally always tried to resolve that conflict by deciding the case, frequently two cases that are
Yes.
that are captioned together and then briefed and argued together. So that may well be the way it comes to the court. I think there's no question that the states, the conservative states, want the court to look at this again, and of course, you know, the science of it has improved so much since Roe versus Wade was decided back in the 70s, and with things that you as a doctor know more about than I do, heartbeat becomes much more detectable. The fetus becomes visible through technology, and that lends some ammunition to the opponents of abortion, it seems to me, because it makes it clearer earlier that the fetus is extant,
Yes.
and at some point even viable.
Yes, and so you get into some very complicated, a very complicated story here. There's also all these other issues about who has access to reproductive, females, ladies, to, reproductive care as far as that happens. And I think in many circumstances, I think particularly in rural Georgia, there's a real shortage of appropriate OBGYN care, and the argument might be that that the people that have access to this technology, or whatever, if you want to use that turn of phrase, are upper class people, and thus they have it, and then no one else does. So the law is sort of unfairly out there, and a sort of another shoe attached to this debate would be the Hyde Amendment. So
right.
Another thing is, in this sort of confrontational story, is the Hyde Amendment doesn't allow, as I understand it, federal dollars to be spent for abortion. And,
That's correct.
And then the people that often need this are very poor people who, it could be said, don't have the same privileges that a person with better economic circumstances might have, and so many people would say this was an unfair law, in some circles, maybe in New York particularly. And then Vice President Biden has then reversed his thoughts on this. So is that
Well,
it's going to be a really
glad you credit him with thoughts. Anyway, it seemed to me to be strictly politics, and I think it was actually bad politics from his point of view. If he had remained in his pro-Hyde Amendment posture, he would have differentiated himself from the rest of the more liberal pack of candidates on the Democratic side. And there are a lot of Democrats, including Governor Casey, who's the defendant in the Planned Parenthood versus Casey case.
Really?
He was a Democrat, governor of Pennsylvania, and his son is now a senator from Pennsylvania. Yes. And they are Roman Catholic, and they are on this issue moderate to conservative.
Yes.
And there are a lot of Democrats like that. And so I think Biden took some very bad advice in changing his views. And of course, it looks quite cynical in any case.
Well, Tom, you said take advice. Are politicians out there, I mean, we've known some, I guess you could say, how the role handlers have? Are there advisors or are there handlers? So when someone says, what ethical position should I take, or what should I do about this? Let's see, you'll have more of a chance of being elected if you do A or B. So the people are constantly just almost being governed by, you could say, handlers. Go out and on whatever.
Yeah, well, the word really,
kiss some babies today, or whatever.
The word really is pollsters. They poll each issue, whether you're in a congressional district or a state or nationally, and of course the candidate wants to know what the people want, and in a congressional district there's an argument to be had that the congressman ought to represent the views of his constituents. When you're a senator, and certainly when you're a president, it seems to me you have a somewhat broader and higher duty to pay attention to the Constitution, to issues of fairness and equality and justice, and heaven forbid your own conscience as well.
Well, we could talk about polling. There are some incredible number of robocalls out there, 6 billion or some number like that. I don't know how many times the phone rings, and on every 5th one or 10th one or whatever, maybe there's someone that wants to poll you on some question. But my thought would be many people are very dismissive of that, and they give, even so much as they're so irritated, they give deliberately wrong information. And in fact, the accuracy of polling is often suspect. And they're also
well, we saw that in the 2016 election.
Yeah, you could say it also in Brexit. I mean, the polls say one thing, and the other thing is sometimes these polls are push-pull polls. So you're aware that, I don't know, President or candidate Smith here loves animals. Do you think that's a good thing, or something like that? Well, I think it's a good thing. And whatever it is, whatever it is, he prays 4 times a day. That's a good thing too. All right. Well, so is this the kind of person you'd like to have as? Well, yeah, I think so. I think he'd be the person I'd want. So there's that, and then there's the sophistry of how the questions are asked.
Sure.
So it appears to me one of the things that go on is in any particular issue that's out there, the side that has a stake in the outcome will produce polls that say, well, 95% of Americans want whatever it is they want, clean water, ergo whatever it is, or maybe the border situation with Mexico. Well, we want 95% of Americans want children to be helped or not injured on the border or something. I mean, so whatever the deal is, the question is asked in such a way that it tilts what goes on, and the power of these so-called polls often influence other people because there's sort of this herd mentality out there. Well, I don't want to be the person that's against children. I don't want any children to be injured, and so ergo I'll support whatever the Democratic position on
Trump's ability to sort of pierce through that in 2016 and declare such polls to be, quote, fake news, close quote, and such things. And then the results in 2016, which defied many of the polls anyway,
yes,
make these polls more suspect, I think, probably than ever.
Well, we'll have to see what happens in our next electoral cycle here. It's some question about that. Now, Tom, as we draw to a close here, do you have any thoughts as to who the next president will be?
Well, I think there's a good argument that the president will be reelected. Incumbents, particularly with good economies and the wind at their back, usually are reelected. George H.W. Bush was not reelected, but that was more a freak election because of the presence of Ross Perot in there, who got something like 17 or 19% of the vote. On the other hand, he'll have his work cut out for him because people tire of the rancor, and they want more sort of quiescent president, and somebody who they don't have to worry about shooting off his mouth every 5 minutes. So that remains to be seen. Of course, that depends a lot on what the a Democrat candidate looks like, and they can't beat somebody with nobody, as they say.
Something like a Hobson's choice, I must say, on that. Well, thank you so much, Tom, Judge, for being here with us tonight. We appreciate your wisdom.
Well, Dr. Robinson, it's a pleasure being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.